Welcome to Evita Studio. My name is Elizabeth, and today we're going to be talking all about quilt math. Now, in quilting, there are a lot of people who like math, who enjoy the challenges of calculating for different designs. And in fact, quilting tends to draw people with that kind of mindset, like mathematicians, engineers, programmers. A lot of those people tend to be drawn to quilting. But on the other end of the spectrum, there are also a lot of quilters who are intimidated by math and who have trouble calculating and figuring things out. So if you're one of those people, I have some simple tips that can help you to be able to design and make your own patterns. Interestingly, that's the first tip that I have. If you're really intimidated by quilt math and you don't want to be able to figure things out on your own, you can always just buy a pattern from somebody. And especially if you have things like stars, triangles, different kinds of shapes, a pattern is often the best way to go because you can save yourself a lot of trouble of having to figure it out. But if you're doing simple patterns, especially if you want to design a simple pattern from what you have or you have your own idea, then you can for sure do that. There's just some simple things that you have to remember. So the big thing that makes quilt math tricky is seam allowance. So seam allowance is the part of the fabric, the edge that goes on the inside. When you cut a piece, it's going to be bigger than the finished piece that it appears in your quilt. And in quilting, typically a seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch. So that means if your piece in your quilt is going to be 4 inches square, then you have to cut 4.5 inches square because you have 1/4 of an inch to go around all the edges of what you're cutting out. So I'm just going to talk about some simple blocks that are made with squares. So this first one is 4-patch block. So the 4-patch block is just 4 equal squares that make up the block. So if you want to know how big the square is, it's a simple thing to do. If you know the total size of the block, you will take that. So let's say, for example, this is a 10-inch block. Then you'll know that before it's sewn into the quilt, it's going to be 10.5 inches. So that means these smaller pieces, they're going to be 5 inches in the finished quilt. So that means we want them to be 5.5 inches when we cut them out. So if we cut out 5.5-inch pieces and we put them together, then we're going to get a square that is 10.5 inches. And then when it's all together in the quilt, it's going to be 10 inches. So just remember, when you're doing the math, dividing by 2 or multiplying by 2, you have to remember, is this with the seam allowances or without the seam allowances? So I'm going to give you another example with this. This is a fun quilt project. I call it an easy squares quilt because it's made up of 4-patch blocks with solid blocks. And that's just like this quilt behind me. This is the charity quilt that I made as part of the Island Ambassador program. And it's easy squares. It has large squares and then 4-patch blocks. So let's think of an example. What if we want an 8-inch block? So we want these squares to be 8 inches. Well, then we know that with seam allowances, if we want 8 inches, we have to cut out 8.5-inch pieces. And then if this is 8 inches, then we know these little ones are going to be 4 inches. And if they're 4 inches, then we have to cut them out at 4.5 inches. So the thing that some people run into problems with is they think I'm going to cut out 8.5 inch pieces, and then the other ones are half the size. So that means I will cut out 4.25 inch sizes. You cannot divide this one by 2. You have to divide the finished size by 2. That's where people run into problems. So just remember, you're dealing with the finished size before you divide by 2 or multiply by 2. So what if you had a big pile of 6-inch strips, or you wanted to cut 6-inch strips because your ruler was 6 inches, and you thought that would be a good size for this big square. You want a 6-inch square. Well then, if you're cutting a 6-inch, then you have to remember, take away the seam allowances. So 6 inches, you to subtract ½ inch for the seam allowance. So your finished size is going to be 5.5 inches. Then the 5.5 inches, if this one's 5.5, these little guys here, they are going to be 2.75 inches. But we can't cut 2.75 inches. We have to add ½ an inch to get the seam allowance. So we will cut them at 3.25 inches. So if you're cutting 6 inches, then your finished size will be 5.5 inches, and then we cut 3.25 to get 2.75. So if you're cutting 6-inch pieces, then you want to cut 3.25-inch pieces to go with it. Don't just divide the 6 by 2 and think you can cut 3-inch strips to go with the 6-inch strips. What if you had 2.5-inch strips and you wanted to use these for these little guys? 2.5-inch strips. Well, if it's 2.5, then we know when we take away the ½ inch for the seam allowance, then we're going to end up with 2-inch squares. So these are 2-inch squares. So we can easily figure out that's going to make these big guys 4-inch squares. So to get 4 inches, we need to cut 4.5. So if we have 2.5-inch squares, then we need to also cut 4.5-inch squares for the bigger ones. So just remember, when you're doing the calculations, you take away the seam allowances, then divide or multiply by 2, and then you can add the seam allowances back in. Be sure that you add the seam allowances in before you're cutting. So the next one is, what if we have 9 patch blocks? Well, this is going to be really the same. It's just that you're multiplying or dividing by 3. And sometimes when you start looking at the math, you can find ways to make it easier. So let's say, for example, you wanted to have an 8-inch block and it was a 9-patch block. Well, when you take an 8-inch block and you divide that by 3, you're going to get 2 2/3. Now, most quilters do not use thirds when they are in quilting. And there's no ruler that I've seen that has thirds in it. Thirds don't really work at all. But 2/3 is kind of close to 3/4. So what if, instead of having 2 2/3, what if we made these small squares 2 3/4? Well, when you multiply that by 3, then you would get 8 1/4. So you might want to think about, instead of having an 8-inch block, you could have an 8 1/4-inch block. It's almost the same size, but it makes the math so much easier. So then you just know, if you want the small pieces to be 2 3/4, remember, before you cut them out, you have to add the seam allowance. So 2 3/4 plus a half for the seam allowance, and that will be 3 1/4. So if you cut these pieces 3 1/4, they'll finish at 2 3/4, and then your whole block will be 8 1/4, or with the seam allowances 8 3/4. So just remember how to do the seam allowances. It's not difficult math. Just take it step by step. However, if you really want to do a scrappy quilt and you say, I don't like the fractions, I don't want to bother with that, I have a pattern for this quilt, the Easy Squares quilt, and it has options for almost any size that you could have. And um, it goes through different options. You can choose if you want to make your pattern based on the small squares that you have, or based on the large squares, or based on the size of quilt you want, or based on how much fabric you have. You have so many different options, and it's called Choose Your Own Adventure Easy Squares. And it's based on Choose Your Own Adventure books that I read when I was a kid. And so we'll say, if you want this, go to this page. So you can check that out in the link below if you really don't want to bother doing this math for your Easy Squares quilt. I hope this has been a little bit helpful. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Next week in the studio, we're going to be talking about something really different. We're going to be talking about reversible patchwork seams and using those to make fun window hangings or other reversible patchwork pieces. So see you then. Have a great week. Bye.